My friends, look at the level of moral collapse that has just been documented and that the weak journalism of the mainstream media is trying to hide from you. The United States Trade Office has issued the final verdict of the investigations under Section 301 and 307. This is not a cabinet discussion or a mere bureaucratic dispute over taxes. What happened in the last few hours was a punch in the stomach of the Brazilian kleptocracy. The official report from the USTR puts a frightening number on the table. A punitive tariff barrier that adds up to 25 for censorship and systemic corruption, plus another 12.5 for complicity with labor exploitation. The final bill is a historic tariff of 37.5%. Washington has stamped the mark of infamy on our meat, our soybeans, and our commercial infrastructure, putting the country on the list of geopolitically bankrupt states. The American document creates a true economic exclusion zone in the ports. And the plan at the top of power was to bet on international passivity and the impunity of a closed bloc with Beijing, believing that the facade of sovereignty on the domestic level would be enough to cover up the structural distortions of the regime. They thought that internal decrees could override the market laws of the real world. And the result is the complete blockage of the flow, a luxury of power. Buying anything from this commercial blacklist means that investing in or buying any input from Brazilian territory has become a serious financial risk and a moral loss. It's automatic for any major player on the global stage.
Grande player do planeta que opere na moeda americana.
Aucaster strong aspirations defined the International League of Compadres simply expired. Ports don't lie. Global money flees from nations marked with a sovereign risk label. And the direct impact on the real economy is the immediate drying up of international credit lines. Brazil was isolated by the world's largest market, and those in power have nowhere to run. Now pay attention to the seriousness of the hidden data that reveals the true financial heart of the system. The Washington Intelligence Report exposes the League of Cronies and sheds light on the guts of power. Because the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office and the Labor Prosecutor's Office of Brazil requested the conviction of JBS for buying cattle from farms directly included in the dirty list of slave labor in the state of Paraná. The legal registration was done, the invoices were tracked, and the Intersectoral Inspection A accepted the meat giant's supply chain, but the protection mechanism operated quickly. In the deepest backstage of the federal government, the order was to save the longtime business partner. The minister acted directly at the top of the legal structure and cancelled the public prosecutor's office fine against the corporation. By the way, if I haven't said it yet, JBS, owned by the Batista brothers, Lula's friends or partners, that's a question, not a statement. Look at the level of value inversion. Right after that, the PT government issued a scandalous ordinance creating a new rule about the public registry, which allows big businessmen to make leniency agreements with the federal government, to be removed from the list of offenders, avoiding public embarrassment and forcibly clearing their record. The contradiction is a punch in the gut, my friends. The party that spent 40 years on the campaign trail swearing to defend the worker now uses the official pen of the state to protect the king's friends and shield the billions in profits of the Batista brothers. The consequence in the flow is devastating. The domestic arrangement caused a short circuit beyond our borders. The American satellite ignored the eraser that the Brazilian government used to wipe clean its partners in Brasilia. Washington identified that the meat profits come from illegal pasture land. It goes through government protection, feeds the political structure, and now has hit the wall of the American blockade. The meat money will be withheld. And what the political elite in Brasilia pretends not to understand is that the rules of the international game do not bend to campaign speeches or social media ideological rhetoric. The decisions made by the Department of Commerce are based on the United States' historical and unyielding legal pillars. Section 307 was created in 1930. For almost 100 years, Washington's legislation has strictly prohibited the import of any goods produced, in whole or in part, through forced labor. And what is forced labor, according to their rules? Well, it's any service extracted under threat of punishment or where the worker did not volunteer willingly. The American Trade Office launched 60 simultaneous geopolitical investigations and targeted 54 economies that failed to put legal barriers against goods produced through human exploitation. Brazilia's reaction was to pretend ignorance regarding the enforcement of these rules, treating the weight of Western intelligence as if it were just an ordinary market dispute. The government tried to push the narrative in the press that the American hardening was just a pretentious commercial maneuver. But Donald Trump's intelligence machine operates with satellite data and supply chain tracking. He is not using personal opinions or partial reports. He activated legal mechanisms that are almost a century old to suffocate regimes and structures that finance hostile geopolitical blocs. And that's what Marco Rubio said about Brazil. The consequence in the flow is the immediate freezing of long-term export contracts. When the 1930 law is activated by the US Treasury, any international bank that processes dollar payments for products under investigation becomes subject to secondary sanctions. The financial circuit shuts the gates and dollars stop flowing into the coffers of the trading companies. This is very serious. No one is spreading the truth or the extent of this stranglehold. What we're witnessing is the surgical synchronization of a mechanism that tried to reinstall the pre-Lava Jato past in Brazil. Now pay attention to this, because the legal dismantling of the punishments from the country's largest anti-corruption operation happened, and it was documented step by step by the international market and risk agencies. And the report from the United States Department of Commerce explicitly mentions the decisions of the ministers, like the case of Minister Dias-Toffoli, who single-handedly annulled the billion-dollar fines from the leniency agreements of the companies involved in corruption. The American document points out that Brazil has blatantly failed to maintain the fight against corruption and respect for international contracts. The action plan was designed in 3 very clear stages behind the scenes of power. The Supreme Federal Court paved the way by clearing the criminal records of those involved. The executive command regained control of the public machine, and the old partner conglomerates assessed the scenario to resume absolute dominance of the market under the political blessings of Lula's government. The plan in Brasilia was to create an absolute internal legal shield that would make the king's friends immune to any legal charges and any future investigations. But this behind-the-scenes arrangement has no validity in foreign trade. The American verdict ignored the national political engineering. The consequence in the flow is the destruction of legal security for foreign capital. Pay attention, my friends, because we are talking about checkmate and what comes before kinetic force. That is, before the aircraft carriers arrive in Rio de Janeiro and on the Brazilian coast. Pay attention here. The international investor realized that the Brazilian system reorganized itself to protect its cronies, and the American response was the automatic downgrade of the country to the highest commercial risk category. This is terrible for each one of us Brazilians. Direct investment money evaporated because the world realized that institutionalized crime was forgiven by the very court that should have punished it. And here comes the central point of the collapse of our economic sovereignty and the isolation of our productive sector. The intelligence report presents a true declaration of trade war against the cronies' structure. Brazilian beef was specifically mentioned as a product derived from exploitation and state connivance in the countryside. The American document details that the exponential growth of Brazilian beef exports to the Asian market is deliberately tainted by a lack of oversight and the state's leniency toward humanitarian violations. The warning issued by Washington immediately prohibits the entry of Brazilian beef into the North American market. What Brasilia tried to sweep under the rug of sovereignty was the real extent of the stranglehold, repeating that the Chinese market would make up for any losses in the Americas and that the flow of capital would remain unchanged. But Trump's checkmate is geopolitical and affects global roots. American law punishes countries that import goods produced by forced labor. Since China exports finished products to the United States, if Beijing continues to buy Brazilian meat, for example, which is listed under Section 307, China itself faces severe sanctions and loses access to the American market. Trump created the perfect trap. If Beijing keeps buying, it suffers the consequences. And my friends, panic is widespread in the heart of crony agribusiness. The Chinese market will be forced to drop Brazilian suppliers to save its own economic skin. The price of meat plummets domestically, slaughterhouses start to accumulate unsold stock, and the billions of dollars that sustained Brazil's trade surplus begin to disappear from the national accounts. Now look at the level of the strategic mistake that was made out of pure ideological obsession and diplomatic submission. The trade reports show a brutal disparity in Brazil's trade profile with its global partners, laying bare our dependence. The United States has historically been the main buyer of our high value-added products, importing Embraer airplanes, industrialized engines, turbines, and complex auto parts that generate highly qualified jobs in the domestic market. In total contrast, China focuses almost all of its purchases on raw primary inputs, absorbing massive volumes of soybeans, iron ore, and unprocessed meat. Trump knows that Brazil has traded its strategic partnership with those who build turbines and airplanes for a bloc that only consumes our land and extracts raw materials. In other words, you produce the raw material, send it abroad, and are then forced to buy everything processed from China again. He is just charging the price of that choice in the international markets. Brazil's foreign ministry actively worked to sideline American diplomacy and align all sovereign decisions with the interests of the Chinese regime. By taking on the role of a colonial plantation, Lula is the one shouting imperialists, colonialists, but he serves China, the world's largest commercial empire and an exploiter of third world countries. Brazil serves the biggest commercial empire in the world, which is China, an exploiter of third world countries, for destroying its own industrial know-how so as not to compete with the manufacturing industries of the Asian dictatorship. And what happened? It's the accelerated process of national deindustrialization. When Trump pen taxes Brazilian manufactured products at 37.5%, it makes the factories that still exported technology to the Americas unfeasible. And in Brazil, the flow of high value-added money dries up, leaving the country with only the marginal dividends from land generation and cheap raw materials. Brazil has become an extractive colony by the ideological choice of those in power. The crony system's favoritism is not limited to the big national businessmen. It extends to the tentacles of the Chinese regime on Brazilian soil, showing who really calls the shots in the game. Inspections by the public prosecutor's office revealed that the Chinese automaker bid, yes, my friends, China is also part of the game. But, going back, BYD, which was set up with strong state sponsorship in Bahia, was officially fined for subjecting workers of Chinese origin to conditions analogous to slavery inside its industrial facilities. The reports detail the confiscation of passports and the restriction of freedom of movement of the workers brought from Asia to set up the partner company's structure. What happened in Bahia is the portrait of explicit diplomatic vassalage. BYD is not an isolated automotive company. It is the technological arm of the Communist Party for China's expansion in Latin America. And the activation of the silencing apparatus in Brasilia served to ensure that the flow of credit and the subsidies granted by the government were preserved at any cost, shielding China's strategic interests from the sovereign oversight that should take place in Brazil. And the result is the tightening of Washington's intelligence siege over the country's industrial infrastructure. By accepting this level of submission to the bid, Brasilia turned the national territory into a corridor of leniency for triangular Chinese operations. The United States responded by including the Brazilian automotive and aerospace sectors in customs sanctions investigations. The real consequence is the ban on exporting any component assembled in Brazil that uses inputs from these contaminated circuits. The automakers' cash reserves and the Chinese expansion plan on the continent clashed with tariff realities. Have you noticed the cowardly silence about the real reason for Brasilia's financial isolation and the destruction of our reputation? I'm asking you. The first page of the Department of Commerce report blows the cover off the institutional narrative. The punitive tariff of 25 applied exclusively against Brazil explicitly and precisely cites the suppression of fundamental rights and the prior censorship decisions issued by Minister Alexandre de Moraes against members of parliament, journalists, and American digital platforms. The Washington document characterizes the authoritarian escalation of the Brazilian judiciary as a direct breach of contractual guarantees and of the free international trade of services and intellectual property. The real cost of this decision is not political, it's financial. The machinery of the Supreme Federal Court and the central government operated in absolute alignment. That the financial suffocation of opponents was a security measure immune to outside challenges. They believed that domestic authoritarianism would have no price on the world market. And what's going to happen now is that the bill will be charged in dollars. For the first time in recent history, the authoritarianism from Brasilia has caused direct corporate losses on a billion-dollar scale for the productive sector. The pen that silences the opposition now costs 37.5% more in customs duties for any Brazilian product trying to cross customs borders. The export flow will pay the real price for the loss of democratic guarantees. The global financial market will get the warning. Countries that censor international companies lose the right to operate in the global free market, and that makes perfect sense. If you want to play on our field in dollars, play the game by the rules. My friends, the mood now in Brasilia is one of widespread panic because the gears have started to jam. President Lula has issued direct orders for media attacks and political retaliation against the opposition, focusing the state artillery. And the request for impeachment and public lynching against Senator Flavio Bolsonaro, a pre-candidate for the presidency of the Republic. The government used the party apparatus to try to blame the opposition for the American tariff hike. The attack isn't ideological, it's financial desperation. They know who has the White House phone number and who has the active diplomatic channel that legitimately communicates with the new government of the United States. The top of the system realized that external funding sources are drying up and is trying to use the partisan smokescreen to hide the size of the hole in the actual books. The attempts at political suffocation against the opposition are desperate reactions from a regime that has lost the ability to contain the flight of foreign capital. By trying to destroy the bridges of dialogue with Washington out of pure political panic, the central government is accelerating Brazil's own financial isolation. The flow of money will be blocked at its source, and the national budget's room for maneuver has been reduced to the bare minimum needed to keep allied construction firms alive. My friends, the board is set and time is running against courage, the national kleptocracy. The proposed tariffs of 37.5 did not come into effect immediately. It is in this forum that the U.S. Department of Commerce sets a strict 30-day deadline for interstate negotiations. The government is trying everything to prevent the Trump administration from imposing economic sanctions on Brazil. The defensive reaction of the system will be to try to drag out the process, with empty promises of agreements and legal window dressing in labor and Amazon oversight laws. Trying to buy time until the next elections to keep the flow of money fueling the regime's political base. They will try to fool American intelligence with new sham bureaucratic directives and rehearsed diplomatic speeches. But the economic reality imposes a physical limit on the farce. What you need to understand is that the rising price of meat, the soaring dollar, and the stock market sell-off are not temporary anomalies. They are the real cost of freedom that is starting to be exacted from the outside. The July tariff hike is the bitter medicine necessary to suffocate the financial machinery of the São Paulo Forum that has taken over the institutions by force. When the oxygen of the League of Cronies dries up in the bank accounts of the king's friends, the supporting infrastructure of the regime begins to collapse through self-destruction. It's reality cleaning up the market that the system tried to corrupt. And in the face of this scenario that I presented here, which you won't see on Globo, you won't see on Luciano Huck's show, nor on Angelica's show, no, my friends. Now, we'll separate those who understand the game from those who just absorb television's negative narrative. What we're seeing happening in Brazil is the result of pure management incompetence. Or is it the cold execution of a deliberate sabotage of our economy to hand us over on our knees to the Chinese bloc? I want to see your level of analysis. If you think it's a collapse out of desperation, write the word incompetence in the comments. But if you see the strategic move behind the scenes, comment the word sabotage. Take part in this tally and leave your mark. But the truth is, my friends, you can't rely on the platforms controlled by the system to understand the real game of those who pull the strings of power. Did you understand how Brazil works? Look, Rede Globo and the other broadcast TV stations in the country, they bring you the news, don't they? That's right. But did you know that Lula's own government injected billions of reais into these same TV stations that bring you the news from Brazil? Do you really think they will? Don't forget about what's happening. Or are they going to ask the boss what should be said? And if you want access to truly in-depth analysis, no censorship, no filters, and none of that lukewarm, manipulated narrative they try to force into your head every day through the mainstream media, you need to be part of our intelligence bunker. Click right now on the link. There's a QR code on the screen, a link in the description, and in the first pinned comment. There are more than 3,000 analysts there who fund the truth we bring here. So don't waste time, come join our intelligence bunker. And if you like series and movies, we created a channel with fantastic tips. Stop wasting time on Netflix or Amazon trying to pick a movie. I know you want to watch what's good, and that's why we did this work for you. So with weekly tips on series and movies for you to enjoy with your family, no woke culture, no whining. You can be sure you're going to like it. It's there. Click the link in the description, in the pinned comment, and on the card. Follow and support our series and movies channel. Now subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave your like on the video, and treat your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira, and I'll see you next time. See you then.